Late evening, Las Vegas, 1966. The kind of hour when the casino floor is still loud, but the real decisions have already moved behind closed doors. Dean Martin sat at the table not as a headliner, not as the man whose name burned in lights above the marquee. No microphone, no glass in his hand, no jokes prepared. Just a polished wooden surface, a low ceiling, and a room designed to absorb sound rather than amplify it. The VIP lounge was deliberately understated. No windows, thick carpet, leather chairs arranged so no one ever had to turn their back on the door. A single lamp cast a warm, controlled light that left faces half in shadow. This was not a room for celebration. It was a room for alignment. Across from Dean sat a man whose name was never spoken in full sentences. It wasn't necessary. His presence rearranged the posture of everyone else in the room. The casino manager stood slightly behind him, hands folded too tightly. An attorney occupied the far end of the table, eyes lowered, a legal pad untouched. Two other men leaned against the wall, perfectly still, as if movement itself required permission. When the man spoke, no one interrupted, not because they were afraid of his voice, but because silence followed him naturally. "Dean," he said, calm, conversational, as if continuing a discussion already in progress. "You've done good business here." Dean nodded once. No smile, no denial. Just acknowledgement. A thin envelope slid across the table, pushed not toward Dean's hands, but into the space between them. It wasn't sealed. It didn't need to be. 100 million, the man continued, his tone unchanged. Clean, quiet, structured over time. No surprises. Dean didn't reach for the envelope. He didn't lean forward. He simply looked at it, as if assessing weight rather than value. The number hung in the air, absurd in its size. Even for Las Vegas, even for men who measured life in margins and leverage. For a brief moment, the room waited, not for gratitude, but for reaction. Then the man added almost casually, "All it takes is distance. You step back, slowly, no headlines, no drama." A pause. "Frank creates problems," he said next, eyes steady. "You don't." That was the line, delivered without threat, without emphasis. Not an accusation, a classification. Dean's mouth curved into a smile, not the one audiences knew, not the polished ease that sold records and softened interviews. This smile didn't invite laughter. It acknowledged reality. He leaned back slightly, crossing his hands, the picture of composure. But something had shifted. The room felt tighter, as if the walls had moved an inch closer. This wasn't a bribe. Dean understood that instantly. Bribes ask. This was an offer that measured loyalty, not greed. A test wrapped in generosity. No one rushed him. No one filled the silence. The power of the moment lay in its patience, in the unspoken understanding that answers had consequences long before they were spoken aloud. Dean glanced around the room, not searching for allies, not gauging fear. He was reading the space, the way people avoided his eyes, the way no one touched their drink, the way the envelope remained untouched, like a marker placed on a map. Somewhere beyond the walls, the casino pulsed with music and laughter, oblivious to the fact that a line was being quietly drawn. Dean exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, and let the silence stretch just a second longer than expected. For the first time that night, the man across from him studied Dean a little more carefully. Because whatever answer was coming, it was already clear. This was not a conversation Dean Martin had asked for, and it was not one he would be allowed to forget. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Years earlier, before the envelope ever touched the table, Las Vegas had already made its rules clear to anyone willing to see them. In the early 1960s, the city was not a playground built on neon and luck. It was an ecosystem. Money flowed through it like blood, and every artery was monitored. Shows were not booked because they were good. They survived because they were useful. Every laugh, every standing ovation, every sold-out night was connected to something quieter and far more consequential. Dean Martin understood this long before others pretended not to. The Rat Pack wasn't just a group of entertainers drifting from stage to stage. They were leverage. When they arrived, hotels filled. Planes landed heavier. Politicians suddenly found reasons to visit Nevada. The press followed, and where the press went, legitimacy followed behind it. That kind of gravity attracted people who didn't clap. Frank Sinatra sat at the center of it, brilliant and combustible. He could turn a room electric or poison it in the same breath. He remembered favors for decades and took slights personally, even when they weren't meant. To audiences, he was passion and power. To the people who financed rooms and protected margins, he was volatility. Dean was the counterweight. He arrived on time. He didn't shout. He didn't argue in public. He made everyone money without forcing anyone to choose sides. Casino owners trusted him because he never surprised them. Studio executives liked him because contracts stayed intact. Even men who operated outside paperwork preferred Dean's predictability over Frank's fire. That distinction mattered more than talent. Behind closed doors, the logic was blunt. Problems were not negotiated with. They were isolated, reduced, removed. Not with violence, but with absence. The right name disappeared from the wrong stage. The wrong voice stopped being amplified. Dean had watched it happen to others. He knew singers who vanished between seasons. Comics whose phone calls stopped being returned. Careers didn't end in scandal. They simply thinned out until there was nothing left to hold. No one explained it. No one needed to. That was why the offer, years later, made perfect sense. Dean wasn't being punished. He was being elevated, chosen as the safer investment, the man who could keep the machine running smoothly while the rough edges were filed away elsewhere. And the choice had been offered to him precisely because he was trusted. They didn't corner him. They didn't threaten him. They gave him time. Only people with real power could afford patience. The assumption was simple. A rational man would choose stability over loyalty, longevity over complication. Frank, in that equation, wasn't a friend or a legend. He was risk. Dean had always known this moment would come in some form, not necessarily with a number so large it distorted reality, but with a question framed as inevitability, a test disguised as opportunity. What no one in those rooms ever fully grasped was that Dean's understanding of the system didn't make him obedient to it. It made him selective. They allowed him a choice not out of kindness, but because they believed the outcome was obvious. Because from their perspective, loyalty was sentimental, and sentiment was expensive. What they underestimated was that Dean Martin had survived this world not by confusing price with value. And long before anyone asked him to step away from Frank Sinatra, he had already decided what kind of man he would not become. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It never did. In Las Vegas, force was inefficient. Influence moved in layers, each one softer than the last, each one harder to refuse. The first approach came wrapped in familiarity. A man Dean had known for years stopped by his dressing room after a show, smiling too easily, congratulating him on another flawless night. They spoke about ticket sales, about how effortlessly the room responded to him, about how rare it was to find someone who never complicated things. The compliment lingered longer than necessary. "People like you," the man said, adjusting his cufflinks. "You make life simple." Dean listened, already sensing where the conversation was leaning. When the suggestion came, it was phrased as concern. Maybe it was time to think long-term. Maybe some partnerships didn't need to be as visible as they once were. No names were mentioned. None were needed. Dean thanked him and changed the subject. The smile across from him faltered for half a second. The second attempt came disguised as logistics. A scheduled meeting with a network executive ran late. When Dean finally sat down, he was told, casually, almost apologetically, that a few future appearances were being reconsidered. Nothing serious, just adjustments. A reminder that availability depended on harmony. No ultimatums, no raised voices, just numbers, shifting on paper. Dean nodded, asked a question about timing, and made a note he didn't need. He left without arguing, without defending himself. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the meeting itself. By the third approach, the message had refined itself. This time, no one hinted. They showed him a private preview of what his career could look like untethered. Larger solo residencies, extended contracts, fewer obligations, a calendar free of complications, a future designed to feel safe. The presentation was elegant, almost generous. It assumed acceptance. The man explaining it spoke with the confidence of someone describing a plan already approved. Dean watched, hands folded, his expression unreadable. The offer wasn't aggressive. That was the danger. It framed separation not as betrayal, but as evolution. What unsettled him most was the tone. No one sounded angry, no one sounded impatient. They sounded certain. It became clear then, refusing wasn't about declining money. It was about stepping outside an invisible boundary, saying no to a system that rarely heard it. Dean felt the weight of it not in fear, but in responsibility. Every door he walked through affected others, musicians, crew members, people whose livelihoods followed his name. The pressure wasn't just personal, it radiated outward. He spoke less with each encounter. Silence became his defense. Every unanswered suggestion tightened the space around him. The city responded subtly. Conversations shortened. Invitations grew more formal. Familiar warmth cooled into professionalism. No threats, just distance. That was when Dean understood the full design. The machine wasn't trying to crush him. It was offering to carry him, on its terms. All he had to do was step aside from one man. And for the first time, Dean Martin recognized the true cost of refusal. Not punishment, but isolation. The night after the second conversation, Dean Martin returned to his hotel alone. The corridor was quiet in the way only expensive places could afford to be. Carpet swallowed the sound of his footsteps. The lights were low, calibrated to calm rather than impress. When he closed the door behind him, the city remained outside, humming faintly through layers of glass and height. He didn't turn on the main light. A single lamp near the window was enough. It cast long shadows across the room, catching the edges of furniture, leaving the corners untouched. Dean loosened his tie, placed it carefully on the chair, and sat without removing his jacket. There was no rush, no ritual to perform. On the table by the window stood a full glass, untouched. He looked at it for a moment, then away. Not out of temptation, but intention. Tonight required clarity, not comfort. Below him, Las Vegas breathed. Traffic slid through intersections like a controlled current. Neon flickered in disciplined rhythms. From this height, the city looked orderly, honest. Dean knew better. He leaned back and let his thoughts drift, not to stages or contracts, but to rooms smaller than this one, years earlier. Back when he and Frank were still finding their footing. When money was inconsistent and pride did most of the talking. Frank had been difficult even then. Loud, stubborn, quick to anger. But he was also relentless. When he believed in someone, he fought for them without calculation. Dean remembered nights when Frank's temper nearly derailed everything, and other nights, less spoken about, when that same temper kept the wolves at bay, when Frank stepped in front of him without asking, when loyalty was instinctive, not strategic. Those moments never made headlines. Dean understood now what the offer truly represented. Not wealth, not safety, permission, the chance to exist without friction, to be insulated from chaos. But the price was quiet and final. He realized something then that surprised him. Not fear, but certainty. The decision had already been made, long before anyone put a number to it, long before anyone tested him. The glass remained full. Dean felt a tiredness settle in, deep but steady. Not exhaustion from pressure, but from repetition. From the endless assumption that everything had a value if the figure was right. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier. He simply felt done with explanations. What had allowed him to last in this world wasn't luck or charm. It was restraint. Knowing when not to react. Knowing when silence carried more weight than resistance. He stood and looked out over the city one last time, hands resting on the sill. Somewhere out there, people were negotiating his future as if it were already decided. They didn't understand that his strength had never come from control. It came from choosing once and never needing to revisit the choice again. When Dean turned off the lamp and the room fell into darkness, there was no drama in the moment. Only resolve, quiet and unmovable, settling into place. By the time sleep came, the question no longer mattered. He already knew who he was. The following evening, Dean Martin walked back into the same casino through a side entrance most guests never noticed. No entourage, no advisor hovering behind his shoulder. His pace was unhurried, measured, the way it always was when he knew exactly where he was going. The guards recognized him instantly and stepped aside without a word. Respect didn't need instructions. The private corridor smelled faintly of smoke and polished wood. Somewhere beyond the walls, a band was finishing a set, applause rolling like distant weather. None of it reached the closed section ahead. The room was unchanged. Same low ceiling, same controlled light, same table positioned so no one ever felt exposed. The same men occupied nearly the same places, though their posture had shifted, subtly alert now. Anticipation had replaced patience. The man at the head of the table didn't rise this time. "You've had time," he said, not asking a question. Dean took the chair opposite him and settled in, hands resting loosely on the surface. His face showed neither defiance nor submission, only attention. The proposal came again, stripped of ornament. Shorter, sharper. No envelope this time. No explanation of structure or timing. The assumption was that the details were already understood. What mattered now was compliance. Dean listened without interruption. He didn't nod. He didn't glance away. He allowed the words to land one by one until there were none left to offer. For a moment, the room waited for negotiation. There was none. Dean spoke once, not loudly, not carefully. Just evenly, like a statement of fact that required no response. "I don't step away from people I've already stood beside. No elaboration, no justification, no moral framing." He didn't mention friendship or history or principle. He didn't argue value against value. He simply declined to be repositioned. The man across from him studied Dean's face, searching for hesitation, for an opening, for the slightest signal that the sentence could be revisited. He found none. Silence stretched longer than anyone had intended. This was the moment when others usually softened, when they offered alternatives, when fear crept into posture and voice. Dean remained still. Then he pushed his chair back and stood. The sound of the legs against the floor was quiet, but it cut cleanly through the room. He straightened his jacket, not as a gesture of respect, but habit. "I appreciate the clarity," he added, almost politely. And with that, he turned toward the door. No one stopped him. No one gave permission. For the first time that night, the balance of control shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but irrevocably. The refusal hadn't been emotional enough to punish. It hadn't been loud enough to challenge. It simply existed. As the door closed behind him, the room remained suspended in a pause no one could immediately fill. The system had expected resistance or acceptance. What it received instead was finality. And finality, in a world built on leverage, was the one thing money couldn't bend. The shift did not announce itself. It never did. In the weeks that followed, nothing dramatic happened to Dean Martin's career, and that was precisely how everyone knew something had. Phone calls still came, but the tone had changed. Conversations that once carried suggestions now arrived trimmed of advice. Meetings ended faster. Decisions were communicated, not debated. People who had once leaned comfortably into his space now kept a careful distance, as if recalculating where he stood. In Las Vegas, that kind of recalibration was never accidental. At one casino, a long-standing manager greeted Dean with the same smile as always, but his words were measured differently. No casual reminders, no strategic hints, just business, clean and contained. When Dean thanked him and moved on, the man watched him leave longer than necessary. In Los Angeles, a studio executive mentioned, almost offhandedly, that life could be easier when complications were removed early. He said it as a general observation, not advice. Dean listened, nodded once, and changed the subject. The executive didn't push. He wouldn't have dared. What traveled fastest was not the story, but the conclusion. No one repeated the conversation. No one needed to. In this world, silence was the most efficient messenger. It carried only what mattered. People began to treat Dean differently, not warmly, not coldly, but with a kind of careful respect reserved for variables you don't fully control. He wasn't celebrated for what he'd done. He was noted for what he hadn't conceded. That distinction mattered. Frank Sinatra felt it before he understood it. Something in the air around him had loosened. Fewer whispered warnings. Fewer subtle reroutes. No one explained why. Frank didn't ask. He simply noticed that doors no longer closed as abruptly. Pressure that had once been constant eased, just enough to be felt. At a rehearsal one afternoon, Frank glanced at Dean longer than usual, as if sensing a shift he couldn't name. Dean met the look, offered nothing, and returned to the music. That was enough. Among power brokers, the reaction was quieter still. A few influential figures, men whose approval was never verbal, adjusted their stance. They didn't align themselves publicly. They didn't make declarations. They simply stopped nudging Dean toward safer ground. The system had registered his refusal and, instead of striking back, adapted. Not because it approved, but because it recognized a limit. Dean's name continued to open rooms, but now it did something else. It signaled boundaries. The understanding spread that pressure would not move him the way it moved others. That leverage would need to find another route. He hadn't challenged authority. He had declined to participate in its assumptions. And in a world built on expectation, that was disruptive enough. Dean never acknowledged the change. He didn't mention it to friends. He didn't reflect on it publicly. He kept showing up, kept delivering, kept remaining exactly who he'd always been. That consistency became its own message. Without a single headline or confrontation, his refusal had settled into the structure of the industry. Quiet, durable, remembered. The system moved on, but it did not forget. Years later, on a warm evening when the lights felt softer than they used to, Dean Martin stepped onto a stage that no longer needed to prove anything. The room was full, not with curiosity, not with tension, but with familiarity. The kind earned over time. The band waited in that effortless stillness that comes from knowing the night will unfold exactly as it should. The audience leaned forward without realizing it. Frank Sinatra stood a few feet away, adjusting the microphone, already halfway into a remark he would never rehearse. The exchange between them was loose, practiced, deceptively casual. A raised eyebrow, a dry aside, a note held just long enough to invite a smile. Nothing about the moment suggested fragility. And yet, unseen beneath the ease of it, was the quiet truth. One decision, made years earlier in a room without windows, had preserved this scene. They sang. They traded lines. They moved through the set with the confidence of men who had outlived predictions. Applause came easily, but neither of them chased it. Dean glanced into the crowd, not searching for approval, not counting faces. His attention drifted past the room as if listening for something older than noise. No one in the audience knew how close this partnership had come to thinning into memory, how easily the rhythm between them could have been replaced by separate contracts, separate nights, separate legacies. That absence lingered like a shadow that never formed. Dean felt no urge to explain himself. He never had. What mattered had already been settled. Not in public, not in print, but in the way certain lines were never crossed afterward. In the way his name carried weight without needing reinforcement. The industry moved forward, as it always did. New voices rose. Old ones faded. Deals were struck and forgotten. But something about Dean's refusal remained embedded in the margins, a reference point people remembered without discussing. He had not won anything measurable. He had simply remained intact. As the final notes dissolved into applause, Dean stepped back, allowing Frank the last word. He smiled, not at the room, but at the familiarity of the sound, the shared space, the continuation of something that had survived pressure without becoming hardened by it. Later, away from the stage, there would be no reflection, no speech about loyalty or principle. Dean would leave as he always did, quietly, without ceremony, carrying nothing that needed defending. The story would never appear in headlines. It would never be quoted correctly, even if it did. That was the point. Some legacies aren't built on what a man claims. They're built on what he declines. And long after the lights dimmed and the rooms changed hands, that restraint, unbought, unadvertised, remained the truest measure of who Dean Martin had been. The rest was just music. And then, finally, silence.